Welcome back, my friends, for another edition of Story Time.
The sound of distant battle drums faded into the horizon, yet inside the royal chambers of Jerusalem, the tension was far more palpable. The king's mind was not on the battlefield, nor on the future of his kingdom. His thoughts swirled, heavy, consumed by a vision, the briefest glimpse of a woman bathed in moonlight, her skin shimmering as if touched by the divine. It was the peak of twilight when King David, ruler of Israel, stood on the rooftop of his palace, seeking a moment of calm from the weight of war. His soldiers, led by the valiant Uriah, were locked in combat far away. He should have been with them, should have been their guiding star, but instead, he lingered behind, his heart heavy with more personal matters. A woman, her beauty undeniable, her presence like a magnet, bathing on a nearby rooftop. The moment was fleeting, but enough to ignite a fire within David, one he had not felt in many years. He was no longer a young king, no longer the warrior boy who felled giants, but this sight, this woman, stirred something within him that he could not ignore. She seemed untouched by the harshness of the world, innocent yet alluring, fragile but strong. He couldn't tear his eyes away. Bathsheba was the wife of Uriah, a man known for his loyalty, bravery, and devotion to both David and his God. Uriah had always been first to raise his sword in battle, leading the king's armies with unwavering determination. And yet, on that night, as David stood in his chambers, staring into the flames of his hearth, it was not Uriah's loyalty or valor that preoccupied his mind. It was the thought of his wife, the very woman David had summoned to the palace under the guise of hospitality. She entered quietly, unsure of the reason behind the king's request, her heart racing. Bathsheba, a woman of wisdom and quiet strength, understood the ways of men, but she had never anticipated being drawn into the desires of a king. She stood before him, humble, respectful, her eyes downcast, yet with a spark that betrayed her unease. David, too, felt the pull of morality, of loyalty to his faithful servant, but it was overshadowed by the intoxicating allure of the woman standing before him. For a moment, there was silence between them, the air thick with tension, the weight of unspoken desires hanging in the space. He reached out, his fingers grazing her hand, and for the briefest moment, Bathsheba hesitated. She thought of her husband, of his love for her, of his bravery on the battlefield. But before she could pull away, David drew her closer. The night unfolded like a dream, or perhaps a nightmare, depending on who told the tale. When dawn broke, Bathsheba returned to her home, silent, shaken, carrying a secret that neither she nor David could ignore. Bathsheba's hand trembled as she delivered the news. She was with child. The king's heart sank. He knew what this meant. Uriah had been away at war for months, and the timing left no room for doubt. David's heart raced, not with guilt for what he had done, but with fear of the consequences. He, the anointed king, had overstepped. His actions, if known, would stain the very crown that rested upon his head. He had to act, and he had to act swiftly. His mind whirred with possibilities until he settled on a plan. Uriah must come home. If Uriah were to spend just one night with Bathsheba, no one would question the child's parentage. And so, David sent for him, his faithful soldier. When Uriah arrived at the palace, David greeted him warmly, a forced smile plastered on his face. He offered him fine wine and praised his courage, then suggested he take a respite from the battlefield, spend a night in the comfort of his home, with his wife. But Uriah, ever loyal, refused. "How can I lie with my wife while my comrades are camped in open fields?" he said, his voice steady, his resolve unwavering. David's heart sank. What kind of man was so righteous, so committed to the cause, that he would deny himself the comfort of his own home? The king pressed him again, but Uriah would not yield. David's panic deepened. His simple plan had failed. Desperation began to gnaw at his conscience, and darker thoughts emerged from the recesses of his mind. A different plan was needed, one far more dangerous, far more irreversible. The next morning, a sealed letter was delivered to Joab, the commander of the army. Uriah carried it himself, unaware that within the folds of that very letter was his own death sentence. The words were chillingly simple. Place Uriah at the front of the fiercest battle, then withdraw from him, so that he may be struck down and die. And so it happened. In the heat of battle, as the Ammonites raged against the walls of their city, Uriah fought valiantly, unaware that his own men had withdrawn, leaving him vulnerable, isolated. The enemy's arrows found their mark, and Uriah fell. When news of his death reached the palace, David's heart was a mixture of relief and a strange, creeping sorrow. His hands were stained with the blood of a man whose only crime had been loyalty. But now, with Uriah gone, Bathsheba was his to take as his wife. The scandal would be buried, the child born without suspicion. In the quiet of the night, when the palace lay still, David was haunted. The face of Uriah, once a symbol of unwavering loyalty, now appeared to him in dreams, a shadowy reminder of the price he had paid for his desires. And Bathsheba, though now queen, was not the same woman he had been enchanted by that fateful night. She was distant, her heart heavy with grief for the husband she had loved, a grief she would never fully reveal to David. One day, the prophet Nathan stood before the king, his eyes piercing and voice grave. He told David a parable, a story of a rich man who, despite having many flocks, stole the only lamb of a poor man. The lamb was cherished, loved like a daughter. The rich man slaughtered it, despite having no need for it. David, enraged by the tale, demanded to know the identity of the man in the story. The weight of his choices crashed down upon David like a torrent. The truth could no longer be avoided. He had betrayed a friend, a soldier, a husband, and his God. The child born of his union with Bathsheba would die, a consequence of his sin, and though David would remain king, his family would be plagued with strife and rebellion. As David knelt in the silence of his chambers, the legacy of his decisions weighed heavy on his heart. He had taken what was not his, destroyed a man's life. And for what? A fleeting desire, a moment of passion that had left in its wake only sorrow and guilt. And yet, even in his darkest hour, David knew that redemption was still possible. But the path would be long, and the scars of his actions would never fade. Friends, if you have listened this far, there must be something likable here, so consider leaving a comment below, a question, or any comment at all, as that will bring more viewers. Also like and subscribe to my channel so I can keep bringing you more contents. Let's continue. Bathsheba sat by the window, her hand resting gently on her rounded belly, feeling the life stir within her. The air outside was thick with the heat of a late summer day, but the heaviness she carried was not from the weather. It was the weight of her own heart. She was the wife of a king now, yet her entry into this palace had been paved with grief and scandal. But in the quiet moments of her pregnancy, she let herself imagine hope. This child, this son, might be her redemption, a balm for the wounds inflicted by their union's tragic beginning. She felt the possibility of renewal in his tiny kicks, and despite everything, she allowed herself to love him deeply before ever seeing his face. When the baby was born, Bathsheba's heart soared in a way she hadn't thought possible. He was perfect, small and fragile, with eyes that barely opened and a cry that filled the halls of David's palace. In those first days, she cradled him close, her chest heavy with the love only a mother knows, a love that binds the soul to something far greater than the self. She whispered songs of protection over him, ancient words her mother had once sung, though now she barely remembered their meaning. She hoped they would shield him from the world's cruelty. David, too, was overcome with joy at the birth. His life had been marked by battles, betrayal, and hard-won victories, but here was a quiet victory, a son born of his desire, a living testament to his legacy. He held the child with a tenderness few had ever seen in him. In those early moments, the weight of his past sins seemed lighter. He believed, as Bathsheba did, that perhaps this child would bring healing to the sorrow and regret that lurked in the shadows of their love. The palace was filled with music and laughter. There was hope in the air, an unspoken belief that life would now move forward, leaving the past behind. But soon, the laughter faded. The child, so full of promise, fell ill. The servants whispered their concerns to one another in the palace corridors, though none dared speak too openly. It was as if a dark cloud had settled over the infant, drawing the warmth from his tiny body. His breaths grew shallow, his skin paler by the day, until even Bathsheba's whispered prayers seemed to dissipate into the air like dust. David, the warrior king, was helpless. He had fought giants, led armies, but here in the palace, facing the slow decline of his son, he was powerless. He took no food, no drink. He abandoned the royal chambers and fell to the floor, where he lay in sackcloth, his face pressed against the cold stone. He wept, not with the loud cries of a king who could command a nation, but with the quiet sobs of a father breaking under the weight of his grief. His heart shattered with each passing day as the child's condition worsened. His prayers, once bold and confident, had become broken fragments of hope, slipping from his lips in the darkness. He pleaded with God, begging for the life of his son. David's mind spiraled into the depths of his guilt. Was this punishment? Was the child paying the price for his sins with Bathsheba? He tore at his clothes, fasted, and refused comfort. He would not rise from the ground, refusing the petitions of his servants. The palace watched in sorrowful silence as their king, once so mighty, was brought low by a grief so deep it seemed to hollow him from the inside. And then, on the 7th day, the baby died. The news was delivered to David with the utmost caution. His servants feared the worst, that the grief might consume him entirely. But David, sensing their hesitancy, already knew. He had seen death too many times not to recognize its approach. His hands, once calloused from battle, now trembled as he pushed himself up from the ground. Without a word, he rose, washed, and dressed. He made his way to the house of the Lord, and there, in a stillness that was almost unbearable, he worshipped. The silence of his heart was louder than any wail of mourning could have been. It was a silence filled with the weight of loss, the surrender to a will greater than his own. When David returned to the palace, he ate, the first time in days. His servants, confused by the change, approached cautiously. "Why is it," they asked, "that while the child was alive, you fasted and wept, but now that he is dead, you rise and eat?" David looked at them with eyes heavy with sorrow, but touched by a strange peace. "While the child was alive, I thought, who knows? Perhaps the Lord will be gracious to me, and the child will live. But now that he is dead, why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I will go to him, but he will not return to me." In her chambers, Bathsheba wept in silence. The arms that had once held her child now felt unbearably empty. The world seemed dimmed, the joy of his birth a distant memory, swallowed by the aching void of his death. Yet in the darkness of her grief, she felt David's presence beside her, the shared weight of their loss binding them together. He spoke to her gently, comforting her, though his own heart was shattered. And in time, another child would be born to them, one who would live, a son who would grow to be Solomon, the wisest king. But on this night, in the quiet of their mourning, there was only the pain of loss. They clung to each other, knowing that love, though bruised and battered by tragedy, still remained. The threads of hope were fragile, but they were there, woven through the grief, reminding them that life, even in its darkest moments, holds the possibility of redemption. And so they mourned, not just the loss of a child, but the weight of their sins, the frailty of life, and the mysterious workings of God. They mourned together, but they also hoped, because in their shared suffering, they found the seeds of a future they could not yet see. Thank you for watching. Click like on this video, subscribe, and comment. And keep coming back, as this rabbit hole is deep. See you back soon again.
Bye.
Also, friends, check out in my channel what punishment King David had to face as a result of his sin, the chaos that happened amongst his sons and daughter. And did Bathsheba get to have another son? We will get to that. Like I said, this rabbit hole is still deep. Go check it out.